So I have the privilege of moderating this next panel, which I'm very excited about. I can't remember too many times where we have this many people that are frontline trauma workers involved in the presentation to get their direct feedback on what we can be doing better from a discharge planning perspective. So let me just introduce who we have here. First, on my immediate right is Ingrid Kuran. Ingrid is a social worker on the trauma floor at St. Mike's Hospital, has been there for some time. Next to Ingrid is Michelle Diamond, who many of you know. Michelle is currently the Director of Case Management with Functionability. She's had extensive experience in the public sector as well, working at Toronto Rehab and at the ABI network as a social worker, and in many other capacities. Next to Michelle is Jessica Schroter. Jessica is also a social worker. She is at the Toronto Rehab Institute helping trauma victims and brain injury patients. And next to Jessica is Zia Poonjiaji, excuse me, did I get that right? Okay. And Zia is a case manager working at St. Mike's Hospital on the trauma floor. So, there's a paper that was put together by the panel, that's at tab 3. Make that 3A, and I invite you to turn that up. The topic we're discussing is best practices for hospital social workers and transitional care coordinators regarding safe and effective discharge planning. And Michelle is going to start off by talking about how we went about getting an understanding of what some of those challenges were, and how we went about coming up with some solutions, and then each of the members of the team will speak to various points. Michelle?
Thanks, Darcy. Good morning, everybody. So in order for us to really be able to understand and be able to present this information back to you, the first thing we started to do was to get a lay of the land, understanding what the current state was from your perspective. You're the individuals that are out there that are, addressing these challenges, facing them day to day. So this panel devised a question, and basically the question was, very simply, what are the significant challenges and barriers to safe, efficient, and effective discharge planning from hospital to home? And so we put this question out to the community providers, hospital providers. We had gotten feedback from families, from clients themselves, and really we got a tremendous response. So thank you for all of you who helped us. We got a tremendous amount of information, and really to no surprise, there was a lot of repetition. There were a lot of similar themes, and so this committee was then tasked with collating this information and putting it together in a way that we could then develop and devise some guidelines, which we're calling our best practice guidelines, a very usable tool that we could then come up here and present to you today as offering a suggestion on ways to navigate within the confines of these challenges, many of which we have no control over. They are simply a matter of the state we're working in, and we do need to continue to work within that. So, the responses that we got, the themes, I believe that in tab, I think it's A, might be 3A, you have a list of all of the information that came back. We did break it down, and really the most common themes and trends...
It's at B.
At B? Okay, thank you. The most common themes and issues that came back are not going to be a surprise. So those included things like communication, paperwork, resources, client-family needs, and then the external factors. So you can take a look through and just read some of the comments. So what we then did was we summarized the information and then we further categorized it. And we presented it in a way, and you're going to be hearing from the different members of the panel today, which really sort of in a very brief overview summarized these findings. When we had this information, what we then did was put together some guidelines, and what we tried to provide to you, and again is in your package today, are some take-home tools, things that you can use and that we're hoping that you're going to be able to share with colleagues, within your hospitals, within your centers, your community agencies, so that we have a sort of a consistent practice and a way of addressing some of the ongoing barriers to this discharge planning. So I'm going to pass it over to Ingrid. I'm going to let you go get us started.
Sure. So one of the main categories that we discovered was an area that was really important to the early components of discharge was the topic of information. and how that information moves between the patient, the family, the hospital staff, community providers, lawyers, and other people involved. So I'm going to start with a very short case example, and I'm going to weave it together with some of the themes that we discovered. So Mr. and Mrs. Z were on their way home from their daughter's house around the corner, walking hand in hand as they always did, when a car came careening around the corner and struck the couple, sending them flying across to the opposite side of the street. The couple had emigrated from China 10 years ago and speak Mandarin. They came to Canada to take care of their 3 grandchildren, ages 3, 6, and 11. The couple's only son and daughter-in-law speak also Mandarin. Initially, the medical team treated life-threatening injuries with care, treatments, surgeries as required. A Mandarin-speaking nurse came and offered to translate, and she translated the post-surgery update to the patient's immediate family. What followed were days of treatments, physiotherapy, recovery, and assessments. 10 days later, the family came to the team to say, "We have just been told by a case manager that our parents are moving to rehab, and we don't understand." They did that with the help of an interpreter. By this time, many of the discharge challenges identified by our survey and those respondents in the realm of information had been made. So let me just initialize a few of those survey results for you, and then we'll move on to some of the other components from my teammates. I'm going to review this same case in my solutions section at the end, hopefully with some solutions that have been added by the rest of the team. So under one of the main components, there was a lack of understanding of the inpatient hospital services. That was one of the main identified points by our survey respondents. And some of the sub-points below that indicated language and communication barriers, MDs deciding to do more procedures when a discharge plan was already made, MDs not easy to access regarding clarification of orders and especially discharge orders, and poor and inconsistent information regarding the inpatient model of service delivery. Mental health and substance use sometimes can mask the cognitive impairments that patients are experiencing, and patient and families not recognizing that follow-up with the hospital in order to ensure OCF 3 and 19 are completed long before discharge. Beyond that, there was a lack of understanding around discharge options and the timing and possibilities. So patients didn't know what was coming next. They had a lack of understanding about what the follow-up appointments were, and they didn't have access to the MD around the time of discharge to discuss that. Beyond that, they really didn't seem to understand, or they were quite confused about their rights and their ability to access benefits. So, and some of the sub-points below that, it seemed to be that the insurance companies, case managers and lawyers seem to do things differently from one another. Some set up services, some don't. Some send disability certificates directly to doctors, some don't. And that made it difficult for patients to find kind of their consistent path through that, especially with the injuries that they were experiencing. And then the hospital staff were unable, and we remain unable, to refer directly to experienced and qualified lawyers to help the patients and families while they are in this state. And we're also unable to intercept when it seems that they've chosen a lawyer without the appropriate expertise to help them. So sometimes we see them kind of fumbling their way through things, and we can't redirect them. It leaves us a little bit tied. So, and people did comment about that. The families did comment about that as well. The other thing that was identified was a lack of information. Patients wanted more concrete information about their injuries, and family members wanted that as well. And there was, there seemed to also be a limited insight about what happens after an ABI, an acquired brain injury, and what happens after the rehab phase. The presentation of that information seemed very important to the people that we spoke to. A lot of times family meetings and other types of meetings are verbal. Doctors come by the bedside, they talk to patients and their families, and with the level of shock going on, people aren't hearing, they're not taking in that information with the same kind of ability that they would normally have should they not be in shock. And so they wanted that information in a written format. That's one of the points that they asked for. We'll address that more when we talk about solutions, but with multiple family members at the bedside, a written document that they can all refer to seems to be a really important part. So I'll pass on now to my other colleagues.
Jessica?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about communication, which was the most commonly identified barrier to the effective discharge planning, and it actually, information leads quite well into this area of communication. So as I was going through the information, there were really two key areas where communication was wrought with challenges, as it often is, especially with large systems like the hospital. The first area was that there was frequent breakdown in communication between the various parties involved. So it wasn't just the hospital, but there was a sense of patients and families not fully understanding, as was mentioned, what was required at this particular stage, perhaps in their recovery or transition between acute to rehab to community, as well as the other private stakeholders who were involved. There was also a sense that getting everyone on the same page about a plan of care for the patient, or what was best for the patient, what the patient and family's wishes were, was not always happening. It wasn't always easy to have a clear plan with so many stakeholders involved. And not surprisingly, it can be very challenging to work within the very tight timelines that the hospital operates within, which has become tighter over time and is something the hospital staff are still adjusting to, and therefore the private providers we work with and patients and families are trying to adjust to as well. The second area in communication was defining who is doing what. So at times it was noted that it was unclear who was responsible for organizing the various aspects of the discharge plan in particular. So this included everything from equipment. Will the hospital staff do a home assessment? Does someone on the private team do this? If home is clearly not appropriate or not set up within a certain time frame, what are the alternate discharge options? How do we find them? What flexibility is available at the hospital for patients to stay longer? There was also a sense within who is doing what, this role definition challenge, that opportunities to work collaboratively were often missed. And along with that each social worker, case manager, discharge planner, therapist, etc., operated differently. So expectations often weren't aligned, and things could get confusing quite quickly about what was going to happen and who was going to do what. If anyone else wants to add.
There's a lot of overlap, obviously, between the issues, but Jessica, if you're done with your section? Okay, so Zia's now going to speak to coordination.
So it's no surprise when you hear Ingrid and Jessica speak that with communication and information challenges, that coordinating the care to be able to discharge these patients home is a huge problem. With the coordination of care, things have to be in place before patients go home. The hospitals are pushing to have patients out earlier and decrease length of stay, so there's always that pressure to have things organized in the home as quickly as possible to meet those discharge deadlines. So with that coordination piece comes some of the challenges in getting there. One of the prime ones being form completion. So whether they're work-related injuries or motor vehicle collisions, what forms need to be completed, who completes those forms, what's the type of information that's needed to complete those forms. Patients and families will often come to us with a whole pile that's been mailed to them by the insurance company of a multitude of forms to complete, and they have no idea where to start. So if we don't have any idea on the hospital end of things, it makes it that much more difficult to really help them navigate through that. And without those initial pieces in place, it then becomes much more challenging to have those services coordinated at home. So form completion and information related to that was sort of a big piece that was identified on the survey. The other piece that follows then along with that is actually coordinating the care in the home. So, have the patients and families secured a private provider in the home, like an OT, to do a home safety assessment to determine what's going to be needed in terms of equipment, et cetera, for home. On the hospital end of things, unfortunately, it is difficult to be able to navigate patients and families to a particular provider or a list of providers. So families are often left struggling themselves with little idea of where to go and how to get there, and who are the companies that they should look for, what kinds of things to look for. So we can give them some guidance, but that becomes a real challenge for them in an area that they've never had to deal with before. If they have a great lawyer in place with expertise in the area of personal injury and accident benefits, then it's helpful to them, right? They often have that piece settled for them, or at least they're directed along those paths. But without that, it becomes much more challenging for them to get those assessments in place in a timely fashion, which leaves the hospital really struggling then to be able to get these patients home, get the equipment coordinated for them to get in there quickly. If forms have been submitted, things like getting an adjuster assigned, have family evens initiated a claim if the forms haven't been submitted. So these are all pieces that really impact and provide huge delays in actually discharging these patients home. Those are just some of the things that were highlighted on the survey. I'll pass it to Michelle then to wrap it up.
So, despite the best laid plans, what we did read on the survey was that a lot of the challenges actually exist in executing these plans, and that's where you can have a great idea and some great suggestions, but how do you actually make it all happen? And we did hear that there were a lot of issues in that regard. A number of people have spoken about decreased length of stay in hospital, and that was identified as a challenge. So by the time somebody's deemed medically stable and no longer needing a rehab or an inpatient bed, the discharge date is set with very little time allowed for any of that planning to actually take place. With a number of years ago, with the decreased changes to the non-catastrophic funding, that's had a huge impact. And certainly in my days in the public sector, this was always an issue I had discharging, because the OHIP, many of the OHIP or ministry-funded programs have, as one of their exclusionary criteria, you cannot have access to motor vehicle funds. But now you have this group within the sector who the funds that they do have are so minimal that they're now sort of limited on both sides. So that continues to be a challenge as well for that sector of for the group that's been deemed non-catastrophic. There's also some confusion as to what in fact is covered, and again, this speaks to the changes back in 2010. So we did hear that from hospital providers, they were uncertain about things like housekeeping, childcare, caregiving, transportation, translation services. And these are programs or services that are very limited in terms of OHIP-funded services. So if you're not using your motor vehicle funds to access these services, you're really stuck. And often, working in a city like Toronto, it's very common to have individuals who, number one, don't speak English as their primary language, don't have family members who speak English as their primary language, and then speaking to the fact that we service people that don't live in the GTA, being trauma centers. I know that, many of the hospitals are seeing patients, 4, 5, 6 hours away. That becomes a huge challenge for the hospital team. They can't go out and do home assessments. They don't have a sense of what the home environment looks like. Added to that, if you want to deal with things like equipment, you need somebody at home to ensure that equipment is being installed correctly. Family members are with their loved ones here in Toronto. Who's going to let them in at home? So logistically, again, you have a great idea. You have the equipment, it's been identified, but the logistics of actually getting the equipment, paying for the equipment, and installing the equipment are all factors that were identified as challenges. Ingrid, you spoke also briefly about, the issue of mental health, and I would broaden that to speak to, comorbidities in general. The issue, confounding actually putting a discharge plan in place is often complicated by existing comorbidities. Mental health is so prevalent within the patient population that we see that looking at the resources and where does this person really fit? Are the resources more related to the head injury? Are they pre-existing? Are they more related to mental health? Whose services do they actually, who would they benefit most from receiving? And then homelessness, again, is a big issue. So you can have some great ideas, but Where is this person going? Where is the equipment going? And even if you do find an environment such as a boarding house or a rooming house, the environments are transitional with respect to who else is there, so you can never be certain of the safety of the individual who is being discharged. So again, it's another issue to the a challenge to the execution. And then lastly, while I don't like to think of family members or caregivers as barriers, but the reality is that despite our best intentions, we are limited by family actually making the decision and providing the consent, if not the client themselves. And that often is a challenge. These are individuals who are in the midst of dealing with terrible circumstances. In most of these situations, it's a very sudden onset. There's no warning. So not only are they dealing with the emotional stress, a lot of people have their own stories. Everybody has their own story they're coming with. And again, we're limited by their ability to make very difficult and often long-term decisions when they're being asked to, whether it's financial, whether it's, choosing a lawyer, choosing a vendor, making renovations to their house, selling their house. We're asking people when they're likely at their most vulnerable to make some very long-term and very definitive decisions, and so that again is another challenge to actually executing the discharge plans.
So with a good understanding of some of the discharge challenges, and again, that survey was completed by representatives of virtually every trauma hospital and rehab hospital, including Hamilton and Sick Kids and Sunnybrook and St. Mike's and Toronto Rehab and others, and health practitioners, families, and survivors. So that was a very concise summary of what we learned. But now the panel took it upon themselves to try to come up with some solutions, because that's what we're here to do, try to come up with some unifying solutions of best practices that will help address some of these challenges. So turning to Ingrid first to speak of the first challenge, the first solution.
Sure. I don't think we came up with these solutions all entirely on ourselves. In our survey, we actually asked people to propose solutions as they were thinking about the problems, and some of the amazing material came out of those rich resources when we compiled that. So that really helped us, I think, guide the path through this, through coming up with some. I'm going to just reread the case study from the beginning with a bit more support in place, and hopefully that will address some of the information solutions. Mr. and Mrs. Z, again, walking on the way home from their daughter's house around the corner, hand in hand as they always did, the car came and struck them. And of course, they were wearing helmets this time, as people always do when they're walking. No, they weren't, but, I always think, why? You should wear helmets doing these things, playing tennis, rollerblading, of course, but walking down the street, you don't think to do that. Anyway, the couple emigrated from China and speak Mandarin. The ambulance attendants had heard from a witness neighbor that the couple speak Mandarin and had advised the ER staff of this immediately. The couple's only son and daughter-in-law, who also speak Mandarin, arrived in hospital within half an hour of the incident with their 3 children. The family were immediately provided with Mandarin information sheet and information about how to access interpretation resources. Initially, the medical team treated life-threatening injuries with the same process. A Mandarin-speaking nurse offered to translate post-surgically, and the language line was utilized as a backup. After the update, the family members were able to go home until the following day. What followed were the treatments and physiotherapy, recovery, and more assessments. During that time, and because of the planning, collaboration, and efforts of all involved, the team came to know the patient's family members and their legal and community supports. Due to language preferences, every staff member offered information, education, and resources regarding hospital services, discharge timing and information, rights and benefits in Mandarin, or with interpretation services. The lawyer and community case manager both spoke Mandarin. Further education resources and hospital service brochure, rights information, and information about how to search for a personal injury lawyer and community providers were translated by a resource nurse and the language line. 10 days later, a family meeting was arranged, and the family, an interpreter, case manager from the community, as well as case manager from the hospital, a social worker, physio, OT, and MD all attended. Later, the family came to the team to say, "We have just been told by a case manager that our parents are moving from hospital to rehab, and we understand how you've come to determine that our parents are ready to make this move." patient and his wife were referred to a rehab program close to the family home the next day, and the MD checked and clarified medications, discharge orders, follow-up appointments, and had answered remaining questions. By that time, the OCF 3 and 19 had been completed, and many of the discharge challenges identified by our survey respondents in the realm of information had been corrected. So, back to the points about information. So providing a written brochure or written materials to the family, as we saw, was a really main component of what they had said. And the documents should provide information about what could be expected, the possibilities, discharge destinations, and timing. Injury resources, so providing documents that direct patients and their families to useful online information or books, publications about their injuries. And helping people access a rights brochure, something that describes to them what's going to happen after an accident, injury, especially motor vehicle accident, and that sort of summarizes how they should go about setting off on this new path. Most people who have a car accident don't have any idea. They've paid into insurance forever and have no idea what comes next. And we have to always treat people in that manner, respectfully, starting where they are. If they have some understanding of that, we'll advance what we talk about. But I think what's really important is that we give them a lay of the land and help them understand some of the basic deadlines that they need to meet early on, and following up, because we know that they're in shock and that they may need that additional support. In the realm of legal support, so providing a guide on how a patient and their family can go about hiring a personal injury lawyer and somebody that can assist them with the qualifications that are required to take them down this path. And, you know, ensuring that they know how to go about making that search, and that search is not going to lend them with a lawyer that's going to require all kinds of upfront costs to be covered and all sorts of obligations to be made, but assuring them that that will all be handled down the road, and so that it allays some of the fears for them. And the last point in this one was just about the private providers, and the private providers are also, there is a really valuable resource, the Trauma Resource Directory that has been created to try to enlist the community of resource providers, and I'm sure many of you in this room are connected and on that directory. But I think also providing information about when, how, and the routes that are possible to finding their private providers, I think is very helpful. Sometimes people choose based on geography or language skills or expertise and training, and sometimes it's a combination of those things, but just helping people to find the resources to help them open up their own pathway seemed to be very helpful. So in the corrected case study, I think we met many of those obligations.
And just to follow up with Ingrid, on the What You Need to Know brochure that Ingrid had referenced, St. Mike's has one right now, which can be used as a precedent for other hospitals. It was done in large part by Ingrid and her team in collaboration with some legal advice from our office to make sure it's accurate when it comes to the benefit rights and obligations and responsibilities. So thank you, Ingrid. Jessica, if you can now address the second point, please.
No, Zia.
Sorry, let's go to Zia.
So one of the pieces in terms of solutions, obviously, has already been talked about, is paperwork and the completion of some of the insurance forms that need to get done. Always a challenge in the acute environment to have those pieces ready and done for the patients, but can really reduce delays in terms of patients getting access to care, getting approval for care, and getting the services they need in a timely fashion. So the OCF1, the application for benefits, really encouraging patients and families to complete that form and submit it into the insurer as soon as possible. That is a form that's completely done by the patient and or their family member on their behalf to submit in. On the hospital side of things that we really try and do, and at St. Mike's we've tried to come up with a good mechanism to be able to do this, although it still doesn't always get done, is then the OCF3, which is the disability certificate. And this cannot be completed by the patient. this needs to be completed by a healthcare professional. So it's a matter of finding the appropriate MD or nurse practitioner, physiotherapist, occupational therapist that can complete that disability certificate and submit it into the insurer in a timely fashion, giving copies to the patient and their family so they have for their own records that they can then provide to their legal team or their private providers as needed. And the last one that we will try and complete for patients as well, if it's appropriate, is the OCF-19, and that's the determination of catastrophic impairment. So in going through the patient's story and compiling their discharge summary, we'll often come across things that qualify them for a catastrophic, namely, as was outlined earlier about the GCS scale, so a GCS within a reasonable time from the time of injury where it was a 9 or less, if they've had a loss of a limb, or if they're paraplegic or quadriplegic. Those are the criteria that trigger the completion, or some of the triggers the completion for an OCF-19. That can only be completed by the physician. Often the attending on staff are the ones that have to complete that. So that sometimes becomes a little bit more challenging to be able to get the MD down to complete those forms and have them sign off on it and have it submitted, but can make a huge difference in the patients being able to access not only the care in a timely fashion, but the amount of med rehab that a catastrophic designation can allow them to access. At St. Mike's, we've tried to come up with a mechanism where, we really try and encourage patients and families to start, at least initiate the claim and obtain a claim number and some of that early information so that we can at least start with the OCF-3 and ideally get that done prior to the patients being discharged, followed by the 19 if it's appropriate for that patient. And all those forms you can find on the FSCO, so the Financial Services Commission of Ontario. It's a public site that you can access all those forms to print out. We often keep copies of those blank ones because patients and families will have lost them, can't find them. They know it got mailed to them, but don't know where to locate it now. And they need to sign off on the disability certificate as well as the OCF-19. So having their signature on that so that you can then proceed forward in completing those forms.
So just to follow up on a couple of the points that Zia mentioned from a legal perspective, the forms are readily available online. It drives us crazy when we show up to meet somebody and they say, well, I'm waiting for the insurer to send me the forms. There's no magic in the forms they're sending. You can print it offline anytime, and it would be great if the hospitals would provide them, like St. Mike's does whenever they can, with the blank forms. Just print them out, give them to them, direct them to the online directory. That's the forms. There's no magic in waiting from the letter from the insurer. And with respect to the OCF-3 and the 19s, when people are discharged without a completed 19, where there should be one, it causes delays and problems. There's no way that we as lawyers or patients can get it done once they're out of the hospital, other than begging the hospital and the MDs who've already discharged a patient to complete it, and that is very challenging. With the 3, it's more flexibility on our end because we can have other people on the private team complete it. But still, whenever it's provided, a discharge is greatly appreciated. So moving to Michelle.
So I'm going to speak a little bit about the necessity of having a community-based team involved as early as possible. One of the nice advantages that we have in the community is that this is all we do. We deal with this legislation, we deal with the SABs day in and day out. On the hospital side of things, only a portion of their patients have actually been injured as a result of a motor vehicle or have access to these benefits. So, one of the points that we'd like to highlight is that use us. We want the hospital people to use us when you can, because you don't have access to these types of resources and the external personnel, the community people, who can help you with facilitating the discharge, dealing with all the equipment, the logistics. On half your caseload, you don't have those services. And as Darcy was mentioning, if somebody is discharged from a hospital before a team is involved, it's so challenging to get anything completed. Everybody probably has a nightmare story where they've been trying to deal with a family doctor who doesn't understand the forms, doesn't want to deal with the forms. They hear MVA, they run the other way. So, we know that that's not going to be consistently a reliable resource to help advocate for your patients. And then the other challenge becomes when the insurers start sending in their own people. It's a very different agenda. While certainly, there's colleagues of ours who do excellent work, let's be honest, it's a different lens you're looking at when you're meeting and assessing a client, if you're working for their insurance company or if you're working, having been appointed either by the family or by their legal representative. So I'm going to speak about two different parts of the team. So the first is the private providers, and again, reiterating how important it is to get them involved as early as possible. These are people who are in the know. These are people that will have answers to questions that perhaps hospital providers may not have. So being able to reiterate and explain the process, the timelines, the services and the resources that in fact somebody is entitled to receive. For most of these people, this is their first experience. They have no idea things like the income replacement benefits, a non-earner benefit. I mean, all of these things are such foreign terms. They would have no idea what would be available to them. So getting those private providers in, again, you can start this process earlier. The community or the private sector providers are also going to be those that have long-term relationships with these people. So, their hospital stay, whether it be acute care or when they transition to rehab, when you think about the lifespan of their rehab process, it's such a tiny portion that actually occurs while in acute care or in a rehab hospital. So really having the opportunity to, build the rapport and help people make the right decisions that they won't regret later on. In speaking with one of my colleagues who works primarily with the spinal cord population, she was saying one of the worst things for her is when she gets involved on a file and sees that, the family has chosen a vendor, because maybe they're familiar with the brand name, but don't actually understand the implications of, the warranties, the follow-ups, the service available. They just went with a name because, it sounded like a name they had maybe heard of before. So really helping people make decisions that do have long-term implications. Again, speaking about lawyers, if the wrong lawyer is involved, and it takes so much time to undo damage. In some cases, you're not able to, but to undo and backtrack, you're really it's not a good use of anybody's time. And again, I spoke earlier about the demographics and how so many of the patients that are seen in Toronto trauma centers and rehab facilities live outside the GTA. Getting that community team involved allows for things like home safety assessments, making sure that services and resources that are close to where that person lives. The hospital team doesn't have the time, the luxury to be able to go out and visit the client in their community. Sometimes you can't rely on what a family member has reported to you. So again, the sooner you have the information, the more accurate information you're going to have, which again speaks to, really ensuring that discharge is planned in a safe manner. And then we come to the discussion about lawyers. We heard through our survey that hospitals, the hospital workers feel very, they struggle because while they know that they want to be able to advocate, they want to be able to ensure that their patients are represented by well-informed personal injury lawyers, their hospitals have simply said no. There's no wiggle room. The hospitals have come down with that definitive, no names, nothing. So we spoke amongst our panel, and certainly we got a lot of good feedback. And one of the best practices that we'd like to suggest is that hospitals take on the role of educator. And, in line with what Ingrid was saying about providing information, is really being able to provide your clients and families with information on how to make that decision. So, for example, identifying, giving them written information on things to know about a lawyer. When they call lawyers, what are some things you want to be asking? And what are some things that you need to make sure your lawyers are armed with? So things like, are they certified as a personal injury lawyer? That's a huge one. We know from a lot of our clients who, they'll often feel more comfortable, or they feel that somebody either with a language or more culturally specific is a better fit. So what we'd like to suggest is that may not always be in the best interest of the client. So really being able to help them understand what the role of the personal injury lawyer is. Helping them understand, people hear personal injury lawyer and they think money, and I don't have the money, how am I going to pay for a lawyer? again, this is, across the board, helping them understand that the lawyers will come and meet with you. They're happy to come and meet with you on your turf, whether it be in the hospital or your home, without any financial obligation for that meeting. They want to be able to explain to you what the rights are. And speaking to rights, the lawyers are really the ones that can best, can give the families the most information on what to expect. They can identify the process, not from a rehab perspective, but really from that logistical, on how long a case takes to settle. They can explain the difference between the SABs and then the tort. They're the ones that can give that information most accurately to the individuals. So, what we're looking at right now is looking at making sure that, all the things we've talked about, information, communication. Again, the lawyers are the ones that are often able to make that happen. So getting access to hospital documents. I know of very few community providers who are able to, foot the bill and say, sure, we'll just request them. That's something that automatically the personal injury lawyers are doing, which just allow us to have that much more information to make sure that we're making informed decisions when making recommendations and suggestions to the clients as well. So those are some of the key points and sort of the rationale that, as a panel and from you as well on the feedback, what were identified as some best practices for assembling a team.
So now Jessica to deal with team meetings.
Okay, so Michelle's spoken about assembling the team. So once the team is assembled, hopefully assembled, particularly at the rehab stage of recovery, team meetings are very important. For patients and families, there's a lot of understandable anxiety at this particular point in their hospital stay. They can kind of see the end of the inpatient system, hopefully, and they're looking at the transition back to the community, which can feel like a giant leap when you've been in the hospital system, when you've had a lot of close support from nurses, doctors. So the team meeting really is an opportunity for everybody to gather and support the patient and family in going over their goals, talking about what we expect with their recovery during the time we have to work with them. It's also a good opportunity to address some of the issues around communication, so who is doing what, how will equipment be put in place, who will do the home assessment. So in the rehab setting especially, we really value having all of the key stakeholders at this meeting. So there are some really practical things that we try to do from a rehab perspective. We try to accommodate scheduling as much as we can. I know it's hard when some of our meetings occur at times that aren't always that flexible, but we do try to involve everybody. That would be the personal injury lawyer or someone representing the law firm, any case manager that might be assigned, and so often there are therapists that are already on file that may also join this meeting. So it's a good opportunity to have everybody involved, to ask questions. And one other point, just a very sort of practical, simple thing. I've had some case managers or lawyers email me questions in advance of the meeting once it's scheduled, and that's actually very helpful because we can target the information and make it a very useful meeting, so we're not kind of using a lot of time for discussion, but we're being really pointed and organized during the meeting. And one other point under team meetings was making sure that families and patients know what this meeting is really about. Michelle talked about the role of educating patients and families, and I think that's very important with team meetings as well, explaining that this is a chance for us as a team to share some updates, to encourage you in your rehab goals, but also an opportunity to meet with the other folks that are involved from the community. And it's important that they're there. It's not a scary thing. It's really a chance to coordinate plans and come up with a very supported plan and transition from hospital back to the community. So I think this particular, just the whole area of team meetings and working with the private providers, one of the things that came up in some research I was doing just on the subject of discharge planning, some best research practice around that was the interdependency of the different systems that are involved for patients and families. So I think that's a really kind of maybe nice point to kind of end on with this team meeting piece, that we are all working together. There's an important role for everybody. And so that sense of interdependency, I think, is very, very key throughout the patient's recovery and the various transition points.
One thing I just want to add to that as well is it's really helpful for the private providers to be at the team meetings. We will often use information there that's either shared or written down, and we can also use that as part of our reports to help justify the recommendations that we're making. You know, oftentimes the insurers will view information being provided by the hospital sector as being perhaps a little bit more unbiased rather than from the private providers who are trying to use this information to justify treatment. If the recommendations that we're, have identified are in fact simply reiterations of what the inpatient team has already suggested, it does give us a little bit more of a leg to stand on when we're making these suggestions. And so, being able to forward our questions to make sure that, perhaps the specific topic is being addressed there and is documented in the family report is tremendously helpful.
Right. So, and that's a great point, because some simple things like a new bed, if a case manager, a private case manager is at the team meeting, they'll know to ask and get and document the opinion of the hospital team about that, and then the insurance company is going to back off. Without that in writing, it's controversy. We try to avoid controversy. The other thing that drives lawyers crazy is when we're prevented, prohibited, discouraged from attending these team meetings at hospital. We go there to solve problems. We go there to take problems off the hospital's plate, facilitate discharge, make things run smoothly. So we'd appreciate if we were encouraged to show up rather than preferred not. So to wrap it up is going to be Michelle. To briefly wrap it up, and then we're going to invite questions for a few minutes before the coffee break, and there are 2 microphones set up, so if anyone's going to have questions, they're free to head towards the microphones.
So what I'm going to do is just draw your attention to the various tabs that follow this presentation. And really, these are the take-home tools. These are the items that we're hoping you'll be able to look at and be able to share with some of your partners back in your other workplace. So the first one is with respect to the checklist for clients involved in motor vehicle accidents, and something that
That's a tab C.
Tab C, thank you. You can direct. So as Zia was mentioning, these are information that family can be getting. And so, what this does is it's a very easy way to provide this form to perhaps evening staff, weekend staff, and staff that either may not, be as aware of what information is required. And it can also be provided to families, really just... Is it? No, it's not on now. Is it on now? Okay. So really it's just a way of presenting the information and making sure that families know specifically what it is they're looking for. So, stating, the name of adjuster. We don't need just the insurance company, but there's additional information that's required. It also goes into a bit of an explanation on some of the OCF forms. So the 3 that really can kickstart, certainly the OCF 1, applying for the benefits, and then the disability certificate and the OCF 19, the catastrophic impairment as well. These are key documents that, if not completed in the hospital, they certainly present, a lot of delays on accessing the services that individuals are going to need. And on here is the website for FISCO, where you can go on and you can pull off any of the documents as well. And then the 3rd page of that, again, speaks to hiring a lawyer. And again, it doesn't mention any lawyers by name. We all looked at it very carefully, and we hope that this will meet with, any of the hospital's guidelines on this. And what it does do is speak to identifying who might be best able to represent you, what types of questions you might be asking when you're looking for legal representation. The next tab is called Critical Path for Communication, and touches, I think communication, as Jessica noted, was the #1 challenge that the survey identified. And, communication in all different capacities. So even within hospitals, from the critical care units to the trauma units, to the rehab, to the community providers, to the family, to the clients, to the lawyers. In any time information is being passed, there's the possibility for information to fall through the cracks. So again, talking about best practices in terms of how to get that information across. Making all attempts to involve the community team, accessing the documents in a timely way, inviting community-based teams to participate in the inpatient meetings, whether it's a family care conference meeting or a discharge planning meeting, and ensuring that all the necessary information is provided to those who need it in order to do their work. So things like follow-up appointments, medication lists, equipment needs, therapy recommendations. The earlier that information is provided, the more seamless the transition will be. And then the last document is, we've called it a critical path for completion for patients involved in motor vehicle accidents. And really it just talks about, again, those three key documents, the OCF1, the OCF3, and the OCF19. The one thing that we do want to reiterate is that a copy of these forms be provided to the client, because in the event that their community team is not established or identified prior to leaving the hospital, trying to backtrack and get access to these, whether they're on a hospital chart or getting them from the insurer, again, just presents further delays. So if the hospitals are assisting families or family members or clients with completion of these forms, we're asking that you please ensure that copies be provided to them so that when the lawyer or the community-based private team is involved, we readily have access to the information provided on those documents.
So, just the last point on that slide is if we do have CAT definition changes, we'll have to revisit these best practices because there may be impacts on the hospital that are going to need to be addressed. So, thank you to the panel. We'd like some questions now. So, I think Peter's got a question over there.
I just have one question, thank you. I was really inspired to hear around conversations around education, supporting people throughout that journey and recovery. I'm just wondering if you've utilized organizations like Spinal Cord Injury Ontario or the Ontario Brain Injury Association early on in your discharge planning as a resource to support that journey of recovery and rekindle the passion for life after sustaining a spinal cord injury or brain injury.
Ingrid, you want to?
Sure, I can comment about my own practice, but not a whole lot beyond that. Very early on, I think discussions of patients' injuries happen, and once a patient realizes that they have this kind of more catastrophic or serious injury that's going to be with them through the course of time, I think that as they adjust, as they go through the shock of learning about their injuries, we have to accompany them. And I think that information and resources that are appropriate and useful, some of the peer support that happens through the spinal cord injury group and also the ABI resources are tremendous for families. And it starts to help them to come out of the shock. So we kind of pace it to when the doctors are informing the patients about those injuries. So early meetings or early touchstone meetings when the doctors come and talk to patients and their families, we try to pair that or follow that fairly quickly with some community and social supports to help them adjust throughout. And I think that's part of all of our roles in some way, and even when it gets to the discussions that Zia might have about a patient leaving our hospital and as they emerge and come into your community rehab and community world, I think those need to continue. And sometimes patients are not ready or willing early on to access those resources, but as they become ready, in they come. At least they've heard about it early on. Yeah.
Other questions?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, okay, so some of the ladies sort of touched on this about giving your client information to help them pick a lawyer. Over the years, I've had a lot of takeover files where someone has started out at another firm and had to switch lawyers once or sometimes even twice. And I often ask them, why did you go with your first choice, whatever. And what I repeatedly hear from people, and I've heard this for years, is they made their initial choice because they saw the name on the back of the bus or they, heard them on the radio, whatever. And even though they'd heard of some of the Bay Street firms, not to name names, but some of the well-known Thomson Rogers of the world, well, I didn't think I could afford that. The guy on the park bench, that looked like a smaller operation. I thought I could afford them. I didn't think I could afford to go to a Bay Street lawyer. And what they don't realize, and I hope you ladies point this out to them, the fees are the same. It's contingency. It's not a fee up front. And so many people come in to that initial meeting and say, how much is this going to cost me?
So I think your question is what else can be done at the hospital to make sure that people understand that their choice in lawyer shouldn't really be impacted by the cost of the lawyer? Or is that well addressed, that it doesn't need to be addressed further in your experience?
I know we definitely take strides at the hospital level to, without providing the names of the ones that we know have the expertise to handle their files, but to give them the guidelines around the types of things to expect. So some of the things that we've outlined in the handouts to you all around, what to look for when you're looking for a personal injury lawyer. And we'll tell patients about that. So the education piece is there, and it's reinforced by other members of the team, to say that you need to make sure that they have the expertise that you need. And if you meet with a lawyer, that there shouldn't be a cost involved with that. A lot of them don't have any consultation fees up front. They'll meet with you, they'll hear your story, before there's any discussion about those kinds of things. So there are attempts to educate. I think a lot of times what we hear sometimes on the acute side of things, our patients and families that sometimes go with the friend of a friend of a friend who used a lawyer in the past, and that becomes a real struggle for us as well. There's a sense of comfort for them in going that someone they know or their friend had, or and the issue may not be the same, and it becomes very challenging for us to help re-navigate them sometimes if you can tell that this is maybe not the best legal representation for them, or they may not have the expertise that your patient's going to need. So we do attempt to make education to the family around those types of things. But often we find ourselves are stuck and are challenged to help maybe change their decisions.
I was just going to add to that if there are opportunities to present to patients and families what things should look like, so if they're coming to me saying, I got a bill in the mail from my lawyer, what do I do with this? Or I don't know what's going to happen when I leave, where the therapy's coming from. If there are some significant gaps or really, big concerns, I sometimes, I think, and the team tries to do this, paint a picture of what things should look like. So when we work with patients who have a very experienced lawyer or case manager, this is what it should look like, and this is what it could look like for you, and there's still opportunity for that. So I think that's the tension, but again, it's an opportunity for education, and I think a role within that tension for advocacy also.
And it doesn't put us in any kind of conflict in our workplace or in our roles at all to say, normally by this point in your journey, the following things would happen. So it's a way that we can actually help and to really ensure that people are on the right track.
And just to finalize that point, one thing we don't know that the hospitals necessarily know is that when somebody changes lawyers, their first lawyer's bill is dealt with by the second lawyer, and they don't have to pay out of pocket or anything like that, and that's often a fear. Next question.
Hi, Laurie Davis from the Ontario Rehab Alliance. Thanks for your presentation. We're often in discussions with FISCO and other sectors around trying to expedite and improve access for private providers for all the reasons that you've outlined. One of the things we often hear is that the CCACs are charged with a role for precisely managing this transition. We know narratively from our members that that's not often the case, and I'm interested to note that I didn't hear any discussion of the CCCA's role in your presentations, and I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little on what you have found that to be.
That's a big can of worms. Hold me back. Let me think for a minute. Yeah, I think, well, Michelle mentioned one of the challenges, and we've certainly encountered this in some of our planning, that we're trying to work with the private team to appropriately manage the resources that they have available through their accident benefits. So we have tried to kind of offset some of that by either using, particularly I think around nursing through the CCAC if someone has a need for wound care follow-up especially. And we're told, as Michelle pointed out, that if they have access to third-party funding, the CCAC won't get involved. And nursing care is a particularly costly service to have in place. So I think, again, there's a lot of challenge working with the CCAC when the person also has access to the accident benefits. And those services for patients who only have access to OHIP funds are very, very limited. So it's, I think, a real challenge. And I think the challenge there is the coordination and working with the CCAC. There are a lot of good things that can happen, but there are ongoing challenges around resources and who's entitled to what, that type of thing. So I don't know if that answers.
Zia or Ingrid, do you want to add anything?
The only thing I can say that we probably don't do as much more recently, Ingrid, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but what we were trying to do in the past, especially where services weren't coordinated in time and the patient, needs to be discharged tomorrow, and it's going to be a while because they're still, initiating the claim. None of the forms have been done. It's several days away before you're even looking at getting services in the home. Is we've tried to use CCAC to sort of bridge the gap. So that CCAC is aware that the patient will likely have funding through their insurer. However, until that's in place, can they bridge the gap? And it's been a bit hit and miss whether that's worked in the past for us. I found before it used to be a little bit more okay, fine, they will continue, and as soon as that's in place, CCAC will back off. But not so much anymore. I think they're a bit more reluctant to take on those kinds of things, and if the patient has third-party funding, then that's the route that we should take. So I can't say that we really use that much more recently. I don't know if you've...
Yeah, I would agree with your comments for sure. One of the things I find is CCAC are having more and more reluctance to participate and to participate as team players. We have a very hard time getting them to come to a team meeting, to come to a discharge meeting, to come to a planning meeting when they are a player in the formula. So yeah, it does present some challenges, and sometimes I think of CCAC like dealing directly with the insurance without a proper representation, because their role is to provide the minimal of what might help the person and to claw it back as quickly as possible. So it's, in a way, they're somewhat similar in my mind.
So last question.
Hi, Paul Standish, case manager. So having attended quite a number of discharge meetings, what I call the catapult process, further to Darcy's point about the importance of, say, getting an OCF 19 signed in a timely way, I find that the various hospitals are a little bit inconsistent in their process when it comes to discharge reports. Some will sort of provide them, but you get the sense that don't tell anybody you should get this for medical records, but I'm going to slide this under the table to you. But in other cases, you have to wait until the person's out of the hospital. And again, from an insurer's perspective, if they had this information, it would be so helpful. So I'm wondering, I don't know what the policy is at St. Mike's, and I'm not sure why there's some inconsistency there.
You're talking about primarily the attachments that go with the OCF 19 in terms of the GCS ambulance call reports and otherwise?
Well,
or just completing the OCF 19?
It's more about the discharge reports that all the disciplines are contributing to, which spell out that the person needs speech path, twice a week and this and that.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So maybe the team can comment on what gets given to the patients upon discharge.
Yeah. Certainly, from a rehab perspective, we try to have a family conference within the first 2 weeks or so of the patient's admission, and a summary of the meeting is typically provided after that, and certainly given to the law firm and a case manager, any therapists that are involved. The challenge that I think we run into with discharge reports is that the team don't complete them necessarily prior to the patient's leaving. So they're completing their final assessments up until maybe the day before the patient is discharged. So that delay is often because of the just the timing of what the therapists need to complete. So we try to manage that. But I think, again, back to the family meeting piece, if there are specific details that need to be in that family conference report or expectations around what might happen at that meeting, it would be good to sort of communicate about that in advance, so that some of those things can make their way into the report. We know that the adjuster needs to see rationale for, how much physio, how much OT, can it be supplemented with RSWs, RTs, that kind of thing. So I think, that is very important. And for the hospitals, the challenge is just getting those things done in a timely way, because we're, like all of you, really busy. So we know it's an important part of the planning, though, and it's used not just for our own records, but for the patient getting what they need.
But I would agree that the inconsistencies across hospitals and even within hospitals is a challenge. But I think it comes down to communication. So as Jessica said, if reports are being provided after the fact, so long as we know we're going to get a copy of that report, then we can feel comforted in knowing that we're making certain recommendations. And in the event the either adjuster denies or says, I need more information, plans an IE, we then have the supplemental documentation. So I think it would be very ambitious for us to expect that we're going to bring about change with documentation standards across the trauma centers and rehab facilities. But I think what we can do is just try to increase the communication that we have with the direct service providers. Again, not asking them to do anything they can't do, but just again ensuring that when the information is readily available, it becomes a routine practice to then provide it back to us.
And that was the whole reason we wanted to put this panel together in the first place, was we wanted more consistency between hospitals to follow some of the very good processes that have been developed by some of the other hospitals, to up the ante and make the practice guidelines very high and onerous and in the best interest of the patients and the clients. So thank you very much to the panel for all your hard work in putting together the paper and presenting today.